The mirror in the wall. It all started when my oldest son, Jack, was about 8 years old. I had heard that kids sometimes go through phases like sleepwalking, so I wasn't too worried at first. It was just one of those strange things that happen. A little unsettling, but nothing I thought much about. I'm a very light sleeper, so none of my children have ever been able to move around the house at night without me knowing. That's actually how I first discovered Jack's habit. Most nights, I would wake up and find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom. He would be walking slightly on his heels, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His eyes would be open, but they weren't seeing anything. That was the part that always disturbed me the most. If you've ever lived with a sleepwalker, you know exactly what I mean. His gaze would pass right through me, empty and distant, like he was looking past me into something I couldn't see. It was always extremely strange, and I never fully got used to finding him like that. Sometimes he'd mumble something under his breath, words too quiet and slurred to understand. Other times, he wouldn't make a sound at all, just standing there, breathing in that slow, steady way that somehow made it even worse. I would gently guide him back to bed, whispering his name, telling him everything was fine. He never remembered any of it the next morning. Things got worse a few months after I realised he was sleepwalking. One night, I woke up to a rhythmic tapping sound. It sounded like water drops repeatedly hitting a window, even though it wasn't raining outside. The sound was soft, barely loud enough to wake me. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, some distant noise that my half-asleep brain had misunderstood. But as I lay there, the sound continued, steady and deliberate. It wasn't random like rainfall would be. It happened at regular intervals and always at the same volume. I kept listening, trying to figure out what it could be. It wasn't the house settling, and it wasn't the wind outside. It was too precise. Once I realised the tapping wasn't going to stop, I reluctantly accepted that I'd have to deal with it. I sat up and looked toward the door, which is where the sound was coming from. My husband was fast asleep, and I didn't want to wake him. I should mention that I wasn't scared, just curious. Otherwise, I probably would have woken him up anyway. I got out of bed to investigate. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw him, Jack, facing the wall, his forehead lightly knocking against it in slow, measured taps. His fingertips gently touched the wall in rhythm with his forehead taps, as if he was trying to walk through it. I remember calling his name, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't react, just kept pressing his head forward, knocking it in that eerie, rhythmic way, like he was testing something, like he was trying to push through. I stepped closer, but right before I was about to stop him, I hesitated. Something about the way he was moving sent a chill through me. I gently reached out and placed my hand on his shoulder, shaking him just enough to pull him out of whatever trance he was in. He blinked, took a step back, and then, as if nothing had happened, let me lead him back to bed. He never mentioned it in the morning. It happened a few more times, but not very often. To be honest, I thought it was just another strange habit of sleepwalkers. Maybe some kind of unconscious response to the wall being there. Some internal sense of space that his dreaming mind hadn't accounted for. Eventually, he outgrew it. The sleepwalking stopped, and the strange, vacant staring in the hallway became a weird little memory that I mostly forgot about. That is, until my younger son, Sam, started doing the same thing years later. The sleepwalking, I mean. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids go through phases, some behaviours repeat themselves. It was just so strange that both of them started sleepwalking around the same age. Again though, nothing too unusual. Genetics are a fascinating thing. but eventually I started noticing the little details, the things that gave me a growing sense of worry. It wasn't just that he sleepwalked, it was how he sleepwalked. He stood in the hallway, shifting from foot to foot, his eyes open but unfocused. He moved the same way as Jack had, with that slow, eerie rhythm, like his movements weren't completely random. It was unsettling. It felt like I was living the memory of watching Jack do the same thing years earlier. But it got worse than that. One night, I woke up to that tapping noise again. I already knew what I'd see before I stepped into the hallway. And I was right. There he was, forehead pressed to the exact same spot, knocking against the wall like he was trying to step into something that wasn't there. It was the exact same behaviour Jack had shown all those years ago, from the forehead taps all the way down to the way his fingers brushed against the wall. I called his name. Nothing. I touched his shoulder. Nothing. He just kept knocking, his small body swaying slightly, lost in some deep, unreachable place. And that's when it hit me. He had never seen his older brother sleepwalk. At least, not that I know of. Jack hadn't done this in years. There was no reason for Sam to show the same exact behaviour. Not just the wandering, but the standing, the tapping, the eerie, misplaced urgency of it. I don't know why, but that thought made me feel sick. After some effort, I eventually snapped him out of his trance. I guided him back to bed and tucked him in, like I had done so many times before, trying to tell myself that it was just one of those things. And then, just like Jack, he outgrew it. Just like that. No more sleepwalking, no more tapping. He had no memory of it either. For years, I didn't think about it. In all honesty, I had forgotten about the whole thing. But there's a reason I'm writing this now. My sons are away at college now, and the house is a lot quieter than what I'm used to. Because of that, my husband and I have to find new things to occupy some of that free time. A few weeks ago, we decided to renovate the house. The house is pretty old, and we've lived in it long enough that we've decided to change things up. New floors, new paint, some fresh updates to make the place feel new again. It was all minor work, nothing too complicated. We were removing the old wallpaper when we noticed something underneath. At first, I thought it was just some old backing or maybe a weird stain. But as we peeled more away, my breath caught. It was an old, antique-style mirror. A mirror that had been covered. For some reason. My first thought was, why would someone cover a mirror instead of removing it? I felt silly standing there, staring at a piece of glass like it was going to do something. But I couldn't help but feel like we weren't supposed to find it, like it had been sealed away for a reason. And that's when I realised the mirror was positioned in the exact spot on the wall that my sons had been bumping into all those years ago. The memories came flooding back, and I stood there in shock. There was no logical reason they should have known it was there. They couldn't have. And yet, somehow they had. Both of them had independently been trying to walk into something that was impossible to see through the wallpaper, and they were unconscious while doing it. I immediately got rid of that mirror, but I'm still really freaked out by the whole thing. There's got to be some kind of rational explanation for this, but I can't think of one. I still don't know what to make of this. I really don't. After we removed the mirror, I thought that would be the end of it. But strange things kept happening. Small things at first, things I could almost convince myself were just my imagination. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. The feeling of being watched, even when I was alone in the house. The temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly, sending a chill down my spine. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like the rustling of leaves, but I could tell it was voices. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and listened. The whispers were coming from the hallway, the same hallway where my sons had sleepwalked all those years ago. I wanted to wake my husband, but he was sleeping so soundly, and I didn't want to alarm him over what might be nothing. I got out of bed and crept to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The whispers grew louder as I stepped into the hallway. They were coming from the spot where the mirror had been. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I wanted to turn back, to run to my room and lock the door, but I couldn't move. I was stuck in place, staring at the empty wall where the mirror had once been, and then I saw it. A shadow, dark and shapeless, began to form on the wall. It started as a small, unclear spot, but it grew quickly, spreading like ink spilled on paper. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I realised they were coming from the shadow itself. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs finally unlocked, and I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, my heart racing. My husband woke up, startled by the noise, and asked me what was wrong. I couldn't speak. I just pointed to the door, my hand shaking uncontrollably. He got out of bed and opened the door, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, silent. He looked at me like I was crazy, and maybe I was, but I knew what I had seen. The next day, I decided to research the history of the house. I had never really thought about its history before. It was just the place we had lived for so many years. But now, I needed answers. I went to the local library and looked through old records, newspapers, anything I could find. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The house had been built in the early 1900s by a man named Thomas Hargrove. He was a wealthy businessman who had moved to the area with his wife and 2 young sons. According to the records, Thomas had been a strict, controlling man, and his wife had died under mysterious circumstances just a few years after they moved in. The official cause of death was listed as an accident, but there were rumours that something else had happened. After his wife's death, Thomas became increasingly isolated. He rarely left the house, and neighbours reported hearing strange noises coming from inside, whispers, cries, and the sound of something being dragged across the floor. Then, one night, there was a fire. The house was badly damaged, and Thomas and his 2 sons were killed. The house sat abandoned for years before it was eventually rebuilt and sold. Over the decades, it changed owners several times, but no one ever stayed for long. There were stories of strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, cold spots, the sound of children laughing when no children were around. But most people dismiss these as made-up stories, the kind that grow over time. I couldn't help but wonder if the mirror had something to do with it. Why had it been covered up? What had Thomas Hargrove been hiding? And why had my sons been drawn to that spot on the wall? The whispers continued every night, growing louder and more insistent. I stopped sleeping, too afraid to close my eyes. My husband thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trying to communicate with me, something that had been trapped in that mirror. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the hallway and stood in front of the wall where the mirror had been. The whispers were deafening now, a mix of voices overlapping, pleading, demanding. I pressed my hand against the wall, and it felt cold, almost icy. And then I heard it, a single voice, clear and distinct. Help us. I don't know what came over me, but I started pulling at the wall, scraping away at the plaster with determination. My husband woke up and tried to stop me, but I couldn't be held back. Finally, I broke through. Behind the wall was a small, hidden compartment, and inside that compartment was a box. I opened the box, and inside were old photographs, letters, and a journal. The photographs were of Thomas Hargrove and his family. In one of them, Thomas was standing in front of the mirror, his face twisted with a dark expression. His wife and sons were in the background, their faces showing clear distress. The letters were from Thomas's wife, writing to someone for help, saying that she was worried about her safety and the safety of her children. The journal was Thomas's, and it showed how his mind had gradually changed over time. He had become fixated on the mirror, believing it was a doorway to another world. He had convinced himself that through certain rituals involving his family, he could gain eternal life. I realised then that the mirror wasn't just a mirror, it was a prison. Thomas had trapped his family's souls inside it, and they had been trying to escape ever since. My sons had been drawn to it because they could sense the spirit's cries for help. I destroyed the mirror, smashing it into pieces and burying them far from the house. The whispers stopped, and the house felt peaceful for the first time in years. But I still can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the sound of tapping on the wall.